Hello there, everybody. I'm here with Chris Merritt to talk about his latest book, The New Home. If you can give us a summary of the plot, please, Chris.
Sure. Well, hi, Alex, and good evening, everyone. Thanks very much for having me. Just going to adjust my laptop there a tiny bit. Yeah, so The New Home, which hopefully you can see the cover of in the center of our screen, is a psychological thriller. And it's about a woman called Freya, who is a documentary maker. And she moves into a new home, which is a doer-upper, with her fiance, Jack, who's just got a new job at the nearby hospital. So they move to this new place full of hope for the future and the family they're going to build, and the home they're going to create together. Freya gets to know the neighbors, including a woman who becomes her friend called Emily. But then a few months later, Emily goes missing along with her daughter. And the police don't seem to be very interested in finding out what happens. So Freya takes it upon herself to investigate. And that's where the story starts to darken a little bit. And yeah, she's trying to find out what happened to her friend.
It's very dark, actually, isn't it? Yeah.
It gets darker as it goes along, I think, which is something that's quite interesting about psychological thrillers. This is actually the first psychological thriller that I've written, and as I was, my publisher suggested that I write it. Being a psychologist by background, I think they're interested to see what I could come up with, and so I did a bit of research because I'd traditionally written, mostly detective stories and police procedurals, and usually with those, you've got the crime at the start, so there's disorder at the start, and then the detective's trying to work out what happened and restore order. Whereas with the psychological thriller, you tend to start off with order, and then there's a gradual descent into chaos, which is sort of what happens here.
What was it like to switch parts of the genre? Because when it's a police procedural, it's very different from a psychological thriller.
That's right, yeah. And I think a major difference, I think, was the point of view, because the detective stories that I've written were all written in the third person, and they have multiple narrators, at least two of which in every book are detectives. And I chose to do that because then you get quite a good overview of what's happening in an investigation. And you've got the narration in the third person, but a sort of third person kind of personal voice of a professional investigator who's trying to make sense of this situation that has been created, a crime that's been committed by person A against person B. Whereas in the psychological thriller, I chose to write this one in the first person. So you're very much in the head of the protagonist, who's not a professional investigator. She's very much an amateur. And she may or may not be kind of misconstruing things in the same way that detectives do, but it's more immediate because of that narration in the first person. So that was a big change.
What made you decide to make her into a documentary filmmaker as a job? Because it's different for the civilian protagonist to be in a job like that.
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, I have a good friend of mine who started his own documentary production company, and I was always interested. Every time we meet up, I'm always interested to hear what he's been making, what he's been researching and producing. It's always good stories, and I quite liked the idea that if I'm writing about an ordinary person who's experiencing some strange things and there's some crime going on and she's trying to work out what it is, I liked the idea of her having some kind of investigative background, so something like journalism, but maybe I wanted to kind of make it. I know there are a few crime series that involve journalists, So I thought rather than have that, I'd give it a slightly different twist, and taking this influence from my friend, make her a documentary maker. So someone who's had experience trying to get to the truth of situations, but still very much, liable to make a lot of those human mistakes that we all make.
Did that make it easier to write? Because it's quite similar to the way a detective would deal with an investigation.
Well, yes and no. So I think yes, in the sense that, she's got some training in how to tell a story, and she's trying to get to the truth of what has happened to her neighbor. But she doesn't have the resources around her of a detective, and that kind of a team of people that can be dispatched to find things out or go and talk to people. She has to do all that herself. She doesn't have the ability to kind of analyze, or not in any kind of professional way, forensic evidence that she might find. And she's not bound by the processes of a detective who would have to be continually logging every decision that they made and justifying every expense to, a detective superintendent who'd be overseeing their team, and essentially just being accountable all the way. Even though the police do have their personal biases sometimes that come into play when they're working on a case, especially a very emotional one like a murder case. It's you're far more likely to get that personal bias when it's just an amateur investigator. So I was interested in that.
Your other books were part of a 3-arc series. So what was it like having a narrow arc to deal with that didn't have a continuation at the end of the book, kind of thing?
I enjoyed that, actually. I found it in a way quite liberating, because I knew that I could, if I didn't need to think about how this story might continue after this book. So that meant that I could wrap everything up just in the one book. I didn't need to think about plot lines like I did with my detective series, which go kind of across 3 books, let's say, which are often personal stories to do with family and relationships and so on. And actually, family and relationships are part of the main plot line of this book. So it was nice to be able to focus on that, but be able to start it and finish it within the space of one book. I think it was Joe Nesbo. I don't know if you're a fan of Joe Nesbo, Alex.
Yeah, I am,
Yeah, so I don't know if you heard, he was once asked about the difference between his Harry Hole series and his standalones. And he said the great thing about standalones is you can just kill everyone off at the end if you want to. So you do have a freedom with the characters that you don't with the series.
Yeah. When you're talking to other authors, has your own experience as a psychologist been interesting to them? Because you were hosting a panel at Bloody Scotland the weekend just gone.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when I speak to other authors and they know that I used to be a psychologist, or I still am a clinical psychologist, but I used to work in the NHS. I think they are instinctively quite interested in that. Crime authors in particular, when I tell them about the parallels between crime writing and telling stories in crime fiction, and, for example, the psychology or the psychological treatment of something like post-traumatic stress disorder, which is all about telling stories of experiences. So they're interested in that, and they're also interested to maybe put names to or details to some of the things that they intuitively know. And I think a lot of good crime writers are, amateur psychologists. They're intuitive psychologists, and they understand the motivations of crime. They write about why people commit crimes. They write about what it's like to be on the receiving end of a crime, to be a victim or to be a witness, for example. And they write about the psychological impact of investigating crimes and being, a professional investigator who is dealing with all this material every day. So they're very interested in psychological experience, and it's good to be able to talk to them about that.
Yeah. Your first degree wasn't in psychology, though, it was in geography. So it must have been quite a switch to psychology, and then decide to write a book. It's a bit of an unusual arc that I wasn't expecting when I did read that.
It was a plot twist for you, Alex.
Yeah.
Yeah, I started out. I mean, when I first went to university, I was very interested in traveling. I was interested in politics. I was interested in languages, and so but I hadn't actually studied languages at A level. So I basically decided to go for geography at university. And at the time, I wasn't necessarily so interested in psychology. I think that came later, when I was just after I'd kind of maybe got a bit older, lived in a few different places, and just decided I wanted to find out more about people and how they behave and the mind and what it does and how it works. And I think it was out of that I started to get interested in crime fiction. And then eventually I just sort of thought, well, I think I could have a go at this. I'd like to write something. And that's how it started.
Yeah, when you first started in 2014, what did your colleagues in the NHS think about the writing?
Well, I think I probably didn't tell too many of them at first, because I think they probably would have first of all wondered if they were appearing in it, since the first thing I wrote did have had a character who was a doctor who was a bad guy in the book, and there were stories that I heard in the NHS, and at the beginning it was kind of, I wasn't really writing necessarily to have a book published. I was writing to kind of entertain myself in a way. So that was how it started. But I gradually told people that this is what I was doing, and eventually the time came where I had to quit my job in the NHS to be able to write more, because I had a contract for a trilogy of books, and I needed to get some more time to do it. So yeah, that was it, the change.
Yeah. So what was it like writing the first trilogy while still working then? Because that must have been hard.
Yeah, it was hectic. Well, the first book in that trilogy I kind of wrote on my own time schedule, which was basically, it took me about 9 months. But then when I got the contract, I then had to write 2 more books, each in about 6 months, and that was just really hard work. So I was working, I think, quite often at weekends, evenings. Yeah, I was just finding all the spare time I could, really. But then it became easier once I decided to drop one of my. I had a couple of different jobs that I was putting together to get full-time work, and I decided to drop one of them, and then that made life a lot easier.
Yeah, 7 books since 2018 is quite a turnaround. How do you find the time to fit it all in?
Well, it is quite a challenge, actually. I have to be honest. In the publisher that I've been writing with, Bookouture, they do set these very ambitious deadlines, and they want you to try and do a book every 6 months if you can. And I know they've had a lot of success with that, particularly focusing on ebooks. But it's you really have to make sure that it kind of fits into your life, and also that you're not kind of sacrificing too many other things as well. So there's, as I've kind of needed to remember really a bit over the last sort of three or 4 years, that there's, you know, there's other things going on. There's friends, there's relationships, there's family, there's sport, there's hobbies, and you know, and I think the more of those things that you do, the more actually it helps with being able to write, because you're writing about relationships, you're writing about society, and if you kind of just if all you do is write, you know, you're not necessarily getting kind of new influences. So yeah, I've slowed down a little bit now, but it was quite busy for a while.
What would you say your influences were when you decided to start in 2014?
Well, there were a number of crime writers who I really admired, and I would read, you know, every year, and still do read everything they write. So, you know, starting really with Joe Nesbo, one of my all-time favorites, such a great storyteller. Then Val McDermid, Mark Billingham, who I know is someone you've had on this.
Yeah, I do really like Mark's work. Yeah,
he's just fantastic. I really liked William Boyd as well. More kind of literary fiction, but he had a phase where he was writing crime novels and thrillers, and they were great. So that was an influence too. And then lastly, I would say Michael Conley with the Harry Bosch novels.
Mark's latest book was in an institution. What have you read it? Yeah.
Not yet. No, that is in my TBR pile, rabbit hole. Yeah.
Yeah. I would say that it's a good one. That's very, very. I think it's. You can tell it's how accurate. I think it's accurate, but you'll have to tell me after you've read it. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to reading that actually, and I think it's you know, Mark's clearly someone who's very interested in psychology with his work, and he's had, you know, a number of kind of psychiatrists and characters like that appear in his books and in medical settings. So I think the idea of a murder in a secure psychiatric ward is really interesting.
When you're working in the NHS, did you ever work anywhere like that?
I never worked sort of properly or full time in a secure ward, but I visited a number of secure wards, and in fact, one service that I worked in, it was an adult mental health service, was just below. It was in the office below a secure psychiatric ward, and sometimes we'd have the police would arrive. They would bring people in who'd been arrested. There was what they call a place of safety that they might bring someone to who's perhaps been causing some kind of incident in public, maybe due to their mental health. So that would be going on. And, you know, I remember once or twice we had kind of riot police lining up on the stairs, ready to go in. And most of the time, you know, pretty quiet. But yeah, and the times that I visited wards, you do see people in a lot of distress. And, you know, sometimes that distress turns into violence, unfortunately. But yeah, those kinds of settings are often the sort of the most extreme, the most acute, because they're people who need the most help and support.
When you were working at your degree, you went off to some unexpected countries as well. Have you ever thought about using those in any of your books, or have you done?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I'd love to do that. It hasn't yet. I haven't yet had the opportunity to do that because the stories that I've been writing have been very much focused on London. Actually, I mean, geographically, they've been very kind of sort of localized in a way.
Yeah.
Although, as you'll know from reading a lot of crime fiction set in London, if you've read Mark Billingham's books, London is a global city with everything going on in it. There are people from all over the world living here. There's all kinds of crimes going on. It's kind of endless material to write about, really, in London. But I would love to write something that's set in kind of more far-flung locations or moves around a lot. But I think that may be almost may require like a different genre, almost like kind of espionage or political thriller, that kind of thing. So
Yeah.
think of John le Carré or something like that, night managers, locations moving around, or Jason Bourne, something like that, Robert Ludlum books.
Yeah. When you were writing from the point of view of a investigating psychologist and the partnerships there, because this book hasn't really got like an investigative partnership. How is that like? And did you talk to anybody that did the job, or was it taken from your own experiences?
Well, there was a bit of both, really, because for the second series, where there's a psychologist who works with the Met Police to help them solve crimes, Dr. Lexi Green, and starting with the book Knock Knock, where she actually begins as the detective's therapist, and then he asks her to help on a serial murder case. That, her job working with post-traumatic stress disorder and working in a clinic in southwest London that's what I did, basically. So the clinic in that book, which I think I've called the Southwest London Trauma Clinic, is very similar to one I actually worked at in Tooting in southwest London. Yeah, and while I was in the NHS, I did have some dealings with the police, but nothing in terms of a kind of investigative capacity. It was more about people who'd ended up being the victims of crime. So I did then had to do a little bit more research for that, and looked online and read some stuff. And I don't know that there's really anyone who actually does what Dr. Lexi Green does in the book. So I kind of freestyled. I used a bit of artistic license with that.
There's nothing wrong with a bit of artistic license. When it comes to artistic license, though, what's the best bit that you enjoyed making up?
Well, I actually love plotting a book. That's one of my favorite times, actually. And I know, I was up at Bloody Scotland weekend before last, and I heard several authors over the course of the weekend say that they don't really plot their books, or they like not to know where they're going. They like to be pantsers, as it's sometimes described, plotters or pantsers.
Yeah.
But I'm very much a plotter, and I love plotting. And for me, that's a really kind of creative time, because I don't need to worry about the detail too much at that stage. Certainly not the level of detail that you need to worry about when you're actually writing, a scene or a chapter. And you can just throw ideas out, and they might be great or they might be terrible, and it doesn't matter. You get them all out, and then you see what might work together. And one of my favorite moments is where you've got some ideas that you've thrown out, and then you realize that a couple of them, if you put them together, would actually create something really interesting. And those are the moments I love. So yeah, that's the sort of most creative, the most fun part for me.
Because you're a plotter, do you find that it makes it easy to write in the 6-month bracket that you've got?
Sorry, Alex, I didn't catch that.
Because you're a plotter, do you find it easier to write in the 6-month bracket that you've got? Because
yes,
yeah,
I would say so, because then when I come to pick up the book, and I don't have the luxury of being able to spend all day doing it. I might have 3 hours or 2 hours in a day to work on it. I know that when I pick it up, this is the bit I need to write. I could go to a spreadsheet I mean, it's quite geeky, although I did hear S.J. Watson saying he does the same thing, color-coded spreadsheets. So you go to the spreadsheet and you know, okay, this is the scene I'm writing. It's in this character's perspective. This is the information that needs to be in it. It's going to be about 1,000 words long. And this is what I have to do now. And that makes it kind of, dividing it into those little chunks makes it easier, I think. And, you know, you were talking about, we were talking just before we went live about some of your plans for studying, and having done some similar studying myself, you know, when you're writing the kind of the thesis, the big project, if you to think about the size of the whole project, you'd sort of be a bit psychologically defeated by it. You just think, this is so big, I'm just going to go and, I don't know, watch YouTube or something. But if you break it down into these little pieces, each of those pieces is kind of manageable, and eventually they come together into this big project.
Because you write it in chunks and you've got it on a spreadsheet, do you write it linearly, or do you just decide, I'm going to write this bit today?
No, I go very much linear, and I don't even move on to the next chapter until I've completely finished one chapter and gone through it at least once to edit it, sometimes twice. So I'm kind of editing as I go, and I like to finish the chapter and then move on. I know there are writers. I mean, I was hearing about William McIlvanney, actually, who had just written, with the book The Dark Remains, he'd had some scenes. You know, maybe you were listening to the same talk, Alex, with Ian Rankin.
Yeah.
That he just had scenes that were kind of written down and sort of disconnected from, but he'd had ideas for scenes, so he'd written them.
Yeah. Is there anybody that you would like to, if you were given the chance, that you would like go, oh, there's a character that I would like to write for or from?
You mean it like in the way that Ian did with yeah. Well, I mean, we were just talking about John le Carré, who, you know, only relatively recently passed away, and a book. You know, if there was some sort of unfinished manuscript, that would be amazing to try and write something like that. I think I'm quite far off getting the call up from his agent or his estate to do that. But that's the sort of thing I would love to do.
Yeah. Considering that you seem to like spy stuff, why was it? Why did you not decide to look at spies? Or was it just because that's what you did that you went into the crime novel kind that you?
Well, I started out with, funnily enough, actually, the first thing that I ever wrote, which probably rightly is, you know, still unpublished and still sitting in a box on top of my wardrobe, printed out in hard copy, was a thriller that was part spy novel, part detective story. And what happened was that when I took it to some agents, and eventually I got an agent for it who liked it, and we worked on it together. But when we took it to the publishers, they all said, we like the detective part of this, but not so much the spy part of it. Yeah. So then when I decided to write a second book, I just made it a detective story set in London.
Yeah. Interesting. Because I've always wondered where I'd start from, because I read that many different types of the genre. I don't know where I'd go from. Yeah.
Well, you could even put two types of genre together, two different subgenres.
Yeah, I probably will end up doing that. When you were talking to Ellie and Lynn about their forensic work and what they've done with their books, what would you say that you've learned from their books and their research? Because they've written that many between them.
Yeah, I mean, it's so impressive, such an impressive collection of work that they both have. And it was a real privilege to sit down with them, and even just chatting to them before and afterwards, you know, about their books and their work. I mean, it's amazing. What came across is really the depth of research that they've done, and getting involved in it personally. You know, Lynn Anderson did a master's degree in forensic. I think in forensic science, and you know, Ellie has been on archaeological digs. You know, her husband's an archaeologist. She's been on pilgrimages. I mean, it was, what came across was really the depth of the research that they've done and the time that they've spent on it. But also their networks of experts who they can go to with questions, because new stuff comes up all the time. And there's always new developments with science and forensics. And I think the hallmarks of their series is that they've stayed on top of those developments and that technology. Val McDermid is someone else who's done that extremely well. And that means that the books have a very kind of contemporary feel to them. But to do that, you need to do a lot of reading, and you need to have experts that you can call up and say, what about this? And how would you investigate that? So yeah, that was really what I learned from that. But it was incredible to talk to them and have that opportunity.
When moving into your own work and Standalone, what would you say is so different about this work compared to your others? Because there's the dark ones from the point of view of the short ones from the point of view of the killer that were really interesting for me.
Yeah. Of those kind of those points of view, and I wanted to have. I was really intrigued by the idea of scenes written in the second person, and it, almost as if you have this. So in the new home, you know, you have these scenes where the person who, may or may not have committed some kind of terrible crime, is speaking to another person, and you don't know who that person is, but you know that the person who is speaking is obsessed with them. And I kind of got the idea for that from a series which I watched and really enjoyed on Netflix a couple of years ago called You. I don't know if you've seen that, Alex.
Yeah, I have. I love it. It's really, really dark, and
it's very dark, isn't it?
Very complicated. Yes,
complicated and creepy and dark, and based on the book by Caroline Kepnes. And I just thought that was a really, really good way of kind of creating that intensity. So if you have, in a psychological thriller, you've got the intensity of first person narration. You know, you're in this amateur investigator's head, and you're sort of privy to all of her thoughts and her doubts and her errors of judgment and her biases and everything else and her emotions. But then every so often you've got this other scene where you're also in someone's head, but you're in the head of an obsessive person who's talking to, you know, you, and you, I know this about you, and you like this, and you do that. And I thought it was quite creepy to be able to have that perspective in there as well.
Yeah, because it did take a while for me to realize who it was, to be honest. It's very interesting because the way you did the tone and stuff, and because there's a lot of people it might have been. What was the challenges about leaving a clue in, and when did you decide that when did you find that you'd worked on it well enough that you could leave clues into that?
Yeah, so I think there's always that process of whenever there's an element of like who done it, and in this case there's kind of a who done it, but there's also a sort of a who will do it, in terms of, you know, something that may or may not happen towards the end. No spoilers. And I think when you finish the first draft, you can go back and say, and read through it and think, are there enough clues in here that if a person is paying attention, they'll guess who it is? they might guess who it is. But it's not too obvious. But at the same time, it's not just kind of out of nowhere, which readers will not be satisfied by. So trying to strike a balance with that. And there is a process of tinkering. And that's also where my editor will come in and say, you need to do more of this or less of that, which is exactly what she said. So I changed some things and hopefully kept it suspenseful.
How useful was your editor when it came to that kind of thing? Because it must be very difficult to kind of, as you say, going back and having to rewrite and put the clues in and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, editor is really, I think, essential for that kind of thing. And if there are people listening who are writing, having a go at writing something that they're writing, maybe working on a first novel, showing it to someone else who then takes on that role of editor, I think is really important. And it's just very good to get another perspective on your work from someone who, isn't you and isn't, for example, like maybe your mum who's going to tell you it's amazing, whatever you've written. You want someone who's going to cast a critical eye on it and say, this worked well, maybe this didn't work so well, or this was clear, this was not so clear, and can you add some details, or maybe it's too obvious and you need to pull it back. Because I think when you're writing, you really get caught up in it, and it's hard to sometimes to see the wood for the trees.
Was the editing process different versus the series to the Standalone?
Pretty similar, actually. I think the editing was maybe a bit lighter for this. I think maybe because in a way it's a simpler story. It's not part of a big story arc. It's only got 2 narrators, and one of them is quite a minor narrator in terms of the space on the page. Compared to the police procedural, where you've got maybe 5 or 6 narrators, all of whom have, not quite equal billing, but they're all substantial contributors to the narration. There's maybe more to change with that. There's more going on, and it's a bit more complicated in a way. But the process is the same in terms of the number of rounds of edits. And I send it to my editor, and she'll send it back to me with kind of big comments like, this character's too nice, make them angrier, or make this event occur earlier in the book, because then there's more tension for the rest of the book. That kind of thing, the big structural changes. And as it goes on, it gets progressively more detailed, to the point where eventually there's an editor, it's a different editor usually, who's saying, you don't want the comma there, put the comma there, or move that full stop, or whatever. That's the process.
How far down the road are you with the new book, considering that you've got a 6-month window and you might have to have another? Yeah.
Well, at the moment, I've actually kind of taken my foot off the gas a little bit, Alex. So at the moment, I'm kind of working on some new ideas. I'm trying to see what I want to do next, and whether I try and do something that's a little bit different, and I want to see how this book goes as well before make a decision about that, because obviously this was a new venture. So It's actually been quite nice to just have a period of time where I've been able to just think of ideas, kind of relax a bit more. Actually, even had a holiday.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So what do you do when you took your foot off the gas? What have you been up to?
I do have another job that I do part of the time as well. So that's consulting as a psychologist. So I've been doing a bit of that. I've been doing a few little bits and pieces around the house. My partner and I had a week's holiday where we went away and seeing family a bit, and just doing some quite nice things, like being able to go to the gym or the climbing wall in the middle of the day when there's no one else there, which is quite nice. So having a little bit of relaxation time, which is quite important, I think.
Do you find yourself still coming up with ideas when you're halfway up a climbing wall?
Yep, definitely. Happens all the time. Happens in the most random places, random things. You'd be out with some people, and they'll be talking about something, and you think that could actually really work really well for a story, and then I'll sort of quite randomly, I'll take out my phone and I'll just sort of start typing notes into it, and it looks like I'm being really rude or kind of texting someone, but then I have to just explain to them that actually I've just had this idea, so I'm going to write it down before I forget it. So my phone is full of like memos, notes I've written to myself with ideas for books and characters and plots and things.
Yeah, I've read a book in the past about a climber, and I think that the fact that when you're in the middle of nowhere and you're on thing, and you can only get down once you're stuck, that must be a great psychological thing that you could probably use. Or yeah,
definitely. I think, and there are a number of authors who've written scenes involving climbing, bouldering and rope climbing, that really well. Val McDermid in The Skeleton Road, there's climbing in that. Joe Nesbo, The Leopard, there's climbing in that. Geetha Lodge, She Lies in Wait, has got some climbing in it too.
yeah,
And it does make for some great drama, I think. This idea of, this sort of perilous activity. I mean, it's not like that when I do it. It's a lot safer. But it can be really, really dramatic.
Yeah. So where is the most enjoyable place that you've been climbing? Where have you gone?
Well, I used to live in Jerusalem when I worked for the Foreign Office. I was posted there, and I had some Norwegian neighbours who were very into climbing, and with some other friends, we used to go out quite a lot into the hills around Jerusalem and into the West Bank, and there's just some spectacular landscape around there to be able to climb outdoors. And of course, the weather there is perfect for it. It's dry and it's usually quite sunny. But back in the UK, when I came back to London about 10 years ago, I was essentially climbing indoors from that time on, mostly because of the weather. I've done some outdoor climbing in the UK, only a very small amount, but mostly now I just go to the climbing wall.
So you say you work for the Foreign Office. Where's the most far-flung place you work for the Foreign Office?
Probably Iraq. So I spent a year there around 2005, 2006, and in Basra. So at the time there was quite a large number of soldiers from British Army around there, and there was quite a lot of lawlessness as well, and there were a lot of politics. There was an election coming up, and there was just a lot going on, and it was quite an intense time, and just a very, very different place, scorching hot in the summer, well over 40, 45 degrees, quite kind of isolated in lots of ways, quite dangerous at times. So a lot of very different experiences there. And then I would come back to London, and it would be like I was on another planet, walking through the middle of London.
Is that why you ended up writing about PTSD, because of your experiences out there?
Well, I think, I mean, I think I became interested in it when I'd been to Iraq, and then I'd lived in Jerusalem after that, and visited places like the West Bank and Gaza, and I met a lot of people affected by conflict, and probably was to some extent affected by it myself as well. And I just thought that the stories that you hear with PTSD are just so interesting in terms of what people have been through, so understandable as to how that can affect people and make life difficult for them. But also, PTSD is a very treatable condition as well. So with the right help, it can basically be fixed. The things that are causing people distress and flashbacks and that kind of stuff. Yeah.
How did that come across in your fiction, when you wrote PTSD in your fiction?
Well, I think in a way there's a lot of traumas. Certainly the traumas that I've heard about, real life traumas that I've heard about in the NHS, a lot of them are crimes. There are a few that are not, that they're just pure accidents. but many of them, especially in London, are crimes. And the process of telling a story to explain what happened, so you unpack a trauma, is the same process that is really taking place in crime fiction, where you're unpacking a crime that, you know, takes place at the start of most crime novels, and you're trying to get to the bottom of it. So I think in almost all of my books, I've had characters who've been affected by traumatic events, and are typically in the books still trying to overcome that trauma, and to deal with it. And you know, I think I can write quite a realistic way about how it affects them day to day.
Yeah. Did you ever do any work with witnesses at all?
Yeah. Quite a number. And I had to write, you know, I did work with witnesses while trials were ongoing for crimes, including one of attempted murder with the victim, which was quite intense, and another person who witnessed the murder. Both occasions while the trials were going on, and I had to write letters for the police to explain what we were doing, and I was never called to give evidence, but yeah, so lots of kind of active cases.
Yeah, because that can be very stressful. Because I know, because I did 10 years of witness support myself, and you know, the witness service. I don't know whether you worked closely with them while you were doing it, or worked with. Yeah.
No, I haven't worked with them actually, but yeah, I know, you know, witnesses can be subject to, you know, tremendous kind of psychological strain for what they've seen, really horrific things.
Yeah.
And they can feel scared and threatened. And it's unusual because, or maybe not unusual, but they haven't necessarily expected to be a witness. Maybe they were just a complete bystander. In one case, there was a person I know who was just looking out of their window. They were literally looking out the window of their house, and they witnessed a terrible crime, and you know, through no fault of their own. And they can sometimes be overlooked psychologically when, you know, understandably and rightly, there's a lot of emphasis on what's happened to the victim, the direct victim of the crime. But in some ways, witnesses are also indirect victims of crime when they become traumatized and feel threatened by what they've seen and what they've been through.
How do you separate your work from the fiction? Because it must be kind of quite difficult to compartmentalize. I mean, that must be part that you trained in doing while you were training, but it's just difficult.
Yeah, I think it's easier now that I'm not in the NHS anymore. I've sort of got a bit of distance from it, I think, so I can, you know, I can stop writing and switch off from the writing very easily, and things that might be influenced by work that I've done in the past that now seem a lot more distant, because I haven't worked in the NHS for over 2 years now. I think maybe 3 years actually. I need to check, but yeah, it's certainly a long time since I've worked in the NHS. So yeah, I find it easier now. It was maybe a bit more difficult back then, but at the time when I was working in the NHS, you know, writing was kind of a way to switch off actually, and I found that actually helped me to de-stress after some quite intense, you know, long intense days working in the NHS.
Yeah. Did you find that inadvertently came into your earlier books and then you had to edit it out?
Yeah, it probably did in some ways, and I think one kind of lesson I learned quite early on was not to put anything in a book that isn't kind of directly relevant to the plot in some way, or the plot or the characters. And I think early on, it's a temptation when you think of like interesting things, or, you know, to kind of put them in the book, but they're not necessarily relevant. But I think where there was something that I did want to include that related more to real life, I was very careful to change lots of elements of it, so that there's no one who could recognize themselves in any of my books, or it's maybe like a part of a story here and a part of a story there that's been put together. But certainly my first book, I would say, the stuff Bring Her Back, the stuff that is in Bring Her Back, virtually every single thing in that book has happened to a real person, and that's all kind of stitched together. The stories are stitched together.
Fascinating. Yeah. I was really interested when I watched you do an interview for Bloody Scotland with a forensic psychologist, and she was talking about her book. What was it like talking to an American practitioner, and how different is it from the UK way of doing things?
Yeah, well, Catherine Ramsland. I mean, if you think of kind of forensic psychology. I mean, I know forensic psychologists in the UK who have worked with offenders, but I think in America the scale of the violence is much larger in society in general. Gun crime, the murder rates, that kind of thing. And Catherine Ramsland, hugely experienced forensic psychologist she's worked with the FBI. She's worked with lots of police departments. She's interviewed serial killers at length. And I mean, her experience is just phenomenal, really. Talking to her, you feel as though you're really in the kind of company of like a world authority, basically, on that kind of thing. The forensic psychology of, particularly as far as she's concerned, murder, her interest and what she's researched.
Did you use any of her work as reference in your previous series when you did it on forensic psychology and stuff?
Yeah, to some extent. I mean, I read her book last year, and it's a collection of stories about killers and how they were caught. So I think that definitely gave me ideas about things that might come across in a book. I can't, off the top of my head, think of a specific example of that, but I'm sure I did borrow or modify one or two from her book of real life cases, because I think it's so much more compelling to write about something that is, has happened. Maybe you're not writing it about exactly what's happened, but along those lines, there has been a crime like that. And book that I wrote, or that was published right at the start of this year, Lost Souls, which was the third book in the Dan Lockhart and Lexi Green series. That book is based on a combination of two real serial killers from Latin America. And I came across at least one of them in while I was doing the research for that interview with Catherine Ramsland. So yeah, there's overlap and inspiration, and real life stuff I think is fascinating.
Yeah. Thank you for giving us a copy of that one. When I saw you with Matt Brolly, I won that as a competition prize. So I've got that in my library to read at some point. Yeah.
That's right. Oh, well, I'm sure your like TBR pile is huge, Alex, with the demands you must get for reviewing.
It is getting rather large. What are you reading at the moment?
Oh, I've actually got two books on the go at the moment. I'm reading The Law of Innocence by Michael Conley, which is a Lincoln lawyer, Mickey Haller, story that is just really compelling, a kind of legal drama. Have you read it?
No, but I love the Lincoln lawyer series.
Yeah.
Is that number 5 or number 6 now? I can't remember.
I think it's 6.
Yeah.
I think it's 6 actually, but yeah. So I'm really enjoying that, and I'm also halfway through, and I'm halfway through Billy Summers by Stephen King.
Yeah.
And I've not read much Stephen King, mainly because I've not really read much of the kind of horror or supernatural genre, really. But this is a straight thriller about an assassination plot and a guy who goes on the run, and it's just brilliant.
I heard him talking to Lingwood Barclay about it, and that's the one that people have been recommending. So I'm going to have to give that a go. What's your new book called, and when is it likely to be out?
Well, there isn't at the moment. There isn't yet anything I can really say. So at the moment there are ideas.
Okay.
But you know, especially with kind of digital publishing, there can be quite a short time from kind of completion of a project to publication. So you know, we could well see something next year, but yeah, at the moment it's just ideas. So it's I have to say, kind of watch this space.
Yeah. So you come up with a synopsis, and then how quick is it from synopsis to the book being finished then?
Well, with these books that I've written recently, I'll do a kind of a maybe 2 to 4 page synopsis and send that to my editor. And if she likes it, she'll give me the green light, and then she'll normally say, "Can you do it in 3 months?" And I'll say, "How about 6?" And she'll say, "What about 4?" And I'll say 5, and then we'll settle on something in the middle. And then I'll then I'll do the maths and realize how fast I have to write, and I'll get going. Yeah, and then the process of editing can sort of take can be about 3 months going back and forth.
Yeah.
The different drafts.
When you spoke on your launch day with another blogger, I know you've done interviews yourself, but what was it like being interviewed on the day of your launch online? That must have been a bit different.
I really enjoyed that. I liked it, and it was something different. You know, it was the first time I believe that my publisher Book Couture had done a publication day interview with a blogger, and you know, Zoe's someone who I met at a Capital Crime Festival a couple of years ago now. Yeah, and she's read my previous books, so I think that was great because it gave some context to this new one. You know, as we've been able to talk about today, the difference between a series and a standalone, and detective story and psychological thriller. And I think she enjoyed it too. I think it was good fun to do something a bit different like that, because normally Book Couture, my publisher, will have the publicity managers will do the interviews, but I think they can get a bit bored of doing that with so many books coming out and people like me.
Thank you so much for doing this today, and I'll definitely be reading more of your books. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Alex. It was a pleasure to join you today, and thanks everyone for listening.
I'm sure everyone will enjoy watching it back as well. Thank you.
Great. Thanks.
I'm just going to stop now.